All right, we should now be streaming live on YouTube. Welcome everybody to our April 2024 Radical Philosophy Hour. I think we've got some really exciting stuff today, so we're all looking forward to this. I think it's going to be a nice discussion about the nature of philosophy, the nature of dialectics, and hopefully we come away with some powerful insights, and I expect nothing less. All right, so our guests today are Doctors Gene Schuler and Patrick Murray, as well as Dr. Rich Daniels. Gene Schuler is professor of philosophy at Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska. She has published in the history of philosophy and critical theory, including articles on Hume, Kant, Hegel, Marx, Arendt, Iris Murdoch, and Habermas. She's co-author with Patrick Murray of False Moves in Philosophy and Social Theory, Losing Public Purpose, and Philosophical and Political Consequences of the Critique of Political Economy, Recognizing Capital. We'll be talking today about false moves in philosophy and social theory. She served as co-coordinator of the Radical Philosophy Association and is working on a series of articles on Hegel and modern philosophy, 4 of which have already been published. Patrick Murray is John C. Kennefick Faculty Chair in the Humanities and Professor of Philosophy at Creighton University, also again in Omaha. He's the author of The Mismeasure of Wealth, Essays on Marx and Social Form, Marx, as well as Marx's Theory of Scientific Knowledge. He's the editor of Reflections on Commercial Life, an anthology of classic texts from Plato to the present. He is also again serving with Gene as co-author of False Moves in Philosophy and Social Theory, Losing Public Purpose and Philosophical and Political Consequences of the Critique of Political Economy, Recognizing Capital. He also served as co-coordinator of the Radical Philosophy Association, and his research interests center on the relationship between capitalism and modern philosophy and include the British empiricists Hegel, Marx, and the Frankfurt School. Again, they'll be talking about false moves in philosophy and social theory, losing public purpose in just a moment. We're also joined by Rich Daniels, who is an emeritus associate professor of English at Oregon State University, where he taught medieval literature and language and introductory linguistics from 1970 to 2003. He came to a serious interest in critical philosophy through study of Frankfurt School thinkers, especially the work of Theodor Adorno, which led him to the study of Marx and German idealism. He also has a serious interest in the work of Benedict de Spinoza, which is somewhat contradictory, he says, because of the issue of the dialectic, which I'm thinking we're going to spend quite a lot of time today talking about, and he'll be presenting notes on the dialectic in Hegel and Marx's Capital. So I think without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Gene and Patrick, who will be presenting their book, False Moves in Philosophy and Social Theory, Losing Public Purpose.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you all. Yes, well, this book grew out of years of teaching and also being shaped by thinkers from early on, especially Hegel and Marx, and more recently Heidegger. Our feeling about teaching through the years is that we wish philosophy had a bigger voice in the world, that it had more of a public impact. And one reason for this not happening, we feel, is that it has gotten stuck with some modes of thinking that keep it out of public life. And so this book is really addressed at trying to identify that flawed mode of thinking and how to sort of recover a kind of live character to philosophy. Our view of philosophy is not that philosophy is about constructing arguments so much as philosophy is about getting to good concepts. And good concepts are, in my view, the great sort of gift that you get out of a philosophy class. They're like a light that can shine on the world. You can see things that bad concepts don't show you. And so in our thinking, there's 3 kinds of concepts we're talking about all the time. There's general concepts that are pretty empty, but there's nothing wrong with them. It's just if you talk too much about things like labor or needs or products of labor, you're not really getting into the world. They're pretty empty. And then the improved concepts, which have content and which open up questions and allow us to think more deeply, we call them socially specific. They take you into the actual institutions of the world. And there's also a third category of pseudo concepts. The pseudo concepts that we focus on in this book are utility, instrumental reason, and sort of wealth in general. As a general category, there's nothing wrong with wealth. The problem is if you think that actual wealth in general actually exists in the world. And so trying to figure out how to teach philosophy so that we get to the good concepts, the good categories, has led us to some thoughts from Hegel. Hegel talks about a kind of thinking he calls Verstand thinking, where you set up these oppositions. And it's really, I think, for Hegel, where thinking starts. So you have these oppositions that are very familiar, like egoism, altruism, life and death, freedom and determinism, intrinsic values and instrumental values. And for Hegel, the oppositions have to give way. He calls that the questions, the doubts, the reflection that these polarizations give rise to. He calls it the dialectic. And in our view, philosophy, as we practice it, gets stuck in Verstand, gets stuck with these polarities, and doesn't yield to the deeper reflection, which allows for concepts to become improved, closer to experience, where you're not taking freedom and determinism and just holding them apart, but realizing that you have to bring them together in some intelligent way in order to have a concept that's useful or good. And you want to talk a little bit about factoring?
Yeah. So false moves. What are false moves? So we use the phrase factoring philosophy as generating false moves or participating in false moves, which we think of as phenomenological mistakes. So we're not phenomenologists in the ordinary sense, but we mean something kind of simple by phenomenology, namely experience-based inquiry into these kind of questions. So in analysis, we make a distinction. Jean was just talking about the bifurcation. So you can make a distinction, but the question is, can you separate what you distinguish? Okay, and that I think is the project of phenomenology. So David Hume gives the example of distinction of reason. You have a white marble globe. So you can distinguish between the whiteness of the globe and the spherical shape, but try separating them out. Okay, you can't. And so so the false moves that we talk about, we also refer to them as pure splits, also bad abstractions, where you're treating as separable things that really are not separable. So in terms of philosophy, then it's a vision of philosophy that philosophy, of course, involves analysis, making distinctions, but then the phenomenological point about philosophy is that you can't separate analysis from phenomenology. So when you make a distinction, the question remains, what you've distinguished, is that something that's separable or not? And factoring philosophy is essentially, or sometimes we call it false philosophy, is a philosophy that's treating as separable things that are distinguishable. You can make an analytic distinction, but you get into trouble when you separate them. And we'll talk about two kind of big cases of that. One, with both of which have a lot of ramifications. One is separating the subjective from the objective, and treating them as as a purist split. So you've got the purely subjective, you've got the purely objective. A lot of philosophy, we think, especially going back to Hellenistic philosophy and some of its renewal in modern philosophy, is about factoring. It's about factoring out what's the purely subjective. So but it has roots, I say, in Hellenistic philosophy. So we have a chapter in the book on Stoicism. And Stoicism is kind of a root. It's interesting. Stoicism is the first philosophy, I would say, that Hegel deals with in the phenomenology of spirit. And so the Stoicism wants to make that purest split between what I am, what I control, and what I don't control in the world. And that kind of splitting runs through the book a lot. And it leads to think, well, Stoic philosophy, it leads to a kind of Hume and others, the kind of purely subjective theory of value. So it leaves you with a picture of a world that has nothing good in the world. And then we're left with preferences to, in the aftermath to that. And it also leads, we argue, to a kind of global skepticism.
Yeah, this is that notion that Verstand, if it doesn't develop, becomes skepticism or sophistry, meaning that if we hold apart categories, polarized categories, bifurcated categories, and don't let the process of reflection challenge that bifurcation and allow for new ways of thinking to emerge, then we're going to find ourselves like sophistry, flipping from one side to the other. Hume will say, well, values are completely subjective. However, there's some values that we all share because our feelings all share that, let's say, murder is wrong. This kind of slipperiness is sort of perpetuated by inadequate concepts or the skepticism, which I think often is how philosophies appears in the world, as being able to move between arguments, but not really being able to carry it through if the categories aren't adequate. So with the subjective and objective, Hegel's suggestion is either ignore the distinction or realize that the more subjective, the more objective. The normal sort of polarized view is you get subjectivity and you're out of the objective, or you have to leave subjectivity behind in order to get to the truth, to get to the objective. You have to achieve a kind of neutrality, and I know those are crude formulas, but getting past them is not always that easy.
Yeah, so we talk about the epistemic Midas touch. So a kind of a skeptical drama where in the as knowers, you start to reflect on the process of knowing and realize that you're actively involved in this through language, through conceptualization. And then comes the problematic move where you think of your subjective involvement as purely subjective. And this is what factoring philosophy wants to do, is to separate out the purely subjective. Same thing in terms of action. So we have a chapter on moral luck. So you deny moral luck by saying, oh, well, no, the luck's not involved in it. You factor out the pure intention, what's purely subjective, and that would eliminate moral luck. So this is something that comes up a lot. So the epistemic Midas touch idea is, as soon as I get involved, as soon as I'm actively involved in knowing the world, I'm falsifying it. And that leads to this a kind of global skepticism.
Or it leads to, this is sort of for me, becomes sort of a little test of the grip of false moves. If I turn in a pragmatic direction and say, well, we don't really know what's real or true, but we know what's works and what's useful. Okay, that's one direction. The less the grip of false moves is on thinking, the more we're able to talk about what's true. We're not allergic to what's true. It just kind of is part of thinking to get to the truth. And you're not worried if it's just true for us or just true for me, because you're always part of the world. You're never outside the world trying to get into the world. So that notion of, well, it's just true for us can't arise. You can certainly identify errors, but in order to identify errors, you have to be in the world to identify the errors. And the errors tell us a lot about the world we're in. So the getting to the world is sort of not the problem that we need to be trying to solve.
Yeah, so we talk about that as recovering the discourse of truth and falsity, instead of, like, factoring philosophy is like, what's the subjective part? Okay, space and time. Oh, those are subjective. Or like C.I. Lewis, the whole, the conceptual schemes, that's purely subjective. Let's factor that out. We're trying to get away from that. The second big one, so the split between the subjective and objective, that has like a lot of ramifications. We just touched on a couple. Another really big one takes us into the latter chapters of false moves, and that concerns the social form. So Jean was talking about three kinds of concepts, general concepts, but socially specific ones. So a microeconomics book that's used at our school has a list of important economic terms. How many of these terms are on the list? Private property, the commodity, money, profit, rent, interest. None of them. None of them. So economics is presenting itself as if, Jean mentioned the idea of wealth in general or production in general as pseudo concepts. So economics is operating as if the object of its inquiry was some kind of economy in general, some kind of mode of production that was not this or that mode of production with these or those specific social forms, relations, purposes. So that's really the other really big one, is the big false move is separating these phenomena, needs, labor, wealth, production, separating them from the constitutive social forms. So when you pick up Capital, the first sentence of Capital answers a question that economics is not even on the radar. Question is, what's the social form of wealth in the societies that I'm going to write about? That's not even a question. I mean, if you ask that in an ordinary economics class, like the social form of wealth, the social form of labor, what are you talking about? No clue. But that's how Marx starts the book. And that's a slap in the face, I think, to Adam Smith, who writes a book, The Wealth of Nations, as if we could write a book about wealth everywhere under the sun throughout history. Yeah, part of what Marx says, this is not, and if economics is making the claim to talk about wealth and production in general, yeah, there is no economics. Marx's book, Capital, is a testimony to that. So we have to look at those things. And of course, I think for me, the shocking features about social theory, not just in economics, but broadly, is for Marx, the crucial categories are value and capital. So capital is self-valorizing value. So you can't understand what capital is without first understanding what value is. So those two questions, what is value, what is capital? Those seem to me the most fundamental questions in really understanding our world today, and they are almost never asked. And again, it goes back to this underlying false move. When you try to separate needs, wealth, labor, production from social forms like the commodity or commodity capital or wage labor, when you separate those, you can't come to grips with the phenomenon.
But one experience that we have when you teach good concepts is like the difference between teaching labor and wage labor. Wage labor is a concept that allows for lots of questions to be asked. Labor is a concept that allows for no questions. It's flat and dull, and people who try to understand the world with these general concepts thinking is a bore. It doesn't go anywhere. But wage labor, you immediately are asking, what determines the wage? And then you get into class struggle and why do you have to sell your labor power? And how do you sell your labor power? And how does your selling of your labor power create value, create wealth? None of those questions are remotely possible with the category of labor. And so the part of the disguise of the world that we live in is we try to get to the world using categories that shed zero light or almost zero light on the world. And so the questions can't be asked. And if you can't ask questions, you can't think. And so the absolutely interesting part of using better concepts is people get turned on to thinking because it's not just jazzy oppositions like egoism or altruism that peter out after a while. It's really digging in and finding yourself involved in what's being talked about, your own life.
Somewhere in Gravity's Rainbow, Thomas Pynchon wrote, if they can get you to ask the wrong questions, they don't have to worry about the answers. So what we're really interested in is how factoring philosophy creates horizons of discourse that really serve to shield the existing society from any embarrassing questions. But the questions that are raised, as Gene's saying, like wage labor, or just the commodity. I mean, I think you can look at the book Capital as a reflection, just like an extended reflection on what does it mean to live in a society where wealth is generally produced in the commodity form. I mean, that's how he starts the book, and you start from there and you go and you reveal all of these things, none of which are available if you're involved in these false moves, these phenomenological mistakes. Marx, I think the great insight in Marx is, in a general way, back in the German ideology with Engels, was the idea that there's always a mode of production. And a mode of production is always a way of life. And it's always going to be thick with moral, social, political, import.
So one of the liberating aspects of good categories is you can get rid of old questions like, is it prescriptive or descriptive? Is it a fact or it is a value? Because when you dig into a good concept, you're always in the descriptive and evaluative. They happen together. And the two other pseudo concepts that are deeply ingrained in the university is utility and instrumental reason. And when students are thinking of reason as instrumental reason, it just makes it really impossible to build up any momentum on thinking about the world when it's seen as an instrument. And utility, likewise, is just such a deeply false idea that there could be something good in general that you could use to sort of calculate. As Marx says, the good is a particular relation between the features of the object and our needs.
Yeah.
And you can't make it purely objective, and you can't make it purely subjective. It involves the person and it involves the object and them coming together in particular ways. And if you try to see what's good about an apple and the third thing that's also good about your car, you can't find any third thing. There is no third thing that combines those goods, because the goods are particular. And yet those theories of utility or preference, etc., are just
everywhere.
They're mother's milk in the university.
Yeah. And I mean, these three pseudo concepts are rooted in what we call the illusion of the economic, which is just this idea that there's some kind of economy in general, which there isn't. Okay, we're out of time.
We've run out of time.
Well, I think we have much food for thought. I wrote pages of notes just now, so I think there's plenty to talk about, which is great. So with that, then I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Rich. I suspect there'll be a significant overlap thematically, but we'll see what happens.
Okay. That's very good. It's great to see old friends again. This is the only way I can do that anymore, and it's wonderful to be in the mix here. I have been reading and thinking about the 3 volumes of Capital in relation to Hegel's work, Hegel's major works that I've read carefully, and trying to figure out what Marx does with Hegel's mode of thinking, specifically with the speculative dialectic. And I want to begin with some assumptions. And so that's what I'm going to talk about. It's a huge subject. I can touch on aspects of it and perhaps give a notion of the whole argument I would like to make. But there are some assumptions I'm going to make. One, I simply accept Marx's thesis on Feuerbach. The 11th one, of course, is the most famous of them, that the point is not to understand the world, the point is to change the world. And that, of course, is a reference to philosophy and a contentious thing. But I think those should all be read together, actually, all 11 theses as a single work. But that's one assumption I'm going to make. A second assumption in the Critique of Dialectical Reason, first volume, translated in English as Search for a Method, Sartre claims that as long as the capitalist mode of production exists, as long as it's the dominant form in society, that the work of Marx represents the horizon of possible thought. And others have held to that. I think of Frederick Jameson. But I'm also assuming that. A third assumption is that Marx's mode of production theory has tremendous explanatory power. And I think Jean and you guys, Jean and Patrick, pointed that out, actually, in the course of your talk. And so I'm accepting that as a way of considering human society. And there, of course, that can be controversial as well, but that's another assumption I'm making. And then I'm assuming that Marx's materialist dialectic, which will be the subject eventually here, not, by the way, diamat, not the old Soviet mode at all, but the materialist dialectic as we find it in Marx's work, and argued best, I think, in what's called Western Marxism, people like Michael Heinrich, for instance. So those are the subjects those are the assumptions I'm making, those four. In his mature work, and I'm considering that to mean here, the 3 volumes of Capital, the Critique of Political Economy, Marx lays out how the capitalist mode of production develops in the late 15th and into 16th century to begin with the development of wage labor and other things, and how it changes. His words are usually transformation and metamorphosis in ways that remain necessary for understanding, critiquing, changing the contemporary global economy, which is driven by the compulsion for surplus value and accumulation. And of course, there's the problem of value that Jean and Patrick mentioned too. Marx's structuring thought in his mature work, that is in the 3 volumes of Capital, which is the limit for my talk, is the materialist dialectic. And this is derived, as he says, from Hegel's speculative dialectic. So I'd like to turn for just a moment to page 102 of Capital. I don't expect you to have this to turn to, but page 102, 103 of the postface to the 2nd edition of Capital, Penguin, rather. So Marx says, my dialectical method is, in its foundations, not only different from the Hegelian, but exactly opposite to it. For Hegel, the process of thinking, which he even transforms into an independent subject under the name of the idea, is the creator of the real world, and the real world is only the external appearance of the idea. With me, the reverse is true. The ideal is nothing but the material world reflected in the mind of man and translated into forms of thought. And then he's skipping over a couple paragraphs. He writes, In its mystified form, the dialectic became the fashion in Germany because it seemed to transfigure and glorify what exists. In its rational form, it is a scandal and an abomination to the bourgeoisie and its doctrinaire spokesman, because it includes in its positive understanding of what exists a simultaneous recognition of its negation, its inevitable destruction. Because it regards every historically developed form as being in a fluid state in motion, and therefore grasps its transient aspect as well, and because it does not let itself be impressed by anything, being in its very essence critical and revolutionary. And so those are from the postface, the second edition. I think that I have pondered over that and wondered over that, not what it means in a sense, but exactly what that means in terms of Hegel's own thought. And so that's the project. Now I'd like to go. You have to excuse me a second. I'm speaking from notes. I want to turn to Hegel's phenomenology of spirit for a moment. Now, and just simply, most simply stated, the dialectic in Hegel, he uses the verb aufheben, of course, and Aufhebung and various, that's always a sign of the dialectic at work, translated usually sublate or something like that in English. The first move is that, well, there's a contradiction, then there's a negation or cancellation of an idea or a mode of thought or something like that. But at the same time, and this is what Aufheben means, at the same time it's negated or canceled, it is preserved as a particular moment. And at that moment, then, with the preservation of the past as a particular moment, it is also transcended and raised up to a new Gestalt is the word Hegel usually uses. Form. He's mostly concerned in this book with forms of thought and spirit. So a new Gestalt forms, but this Gestalt keeps the particular moment as part of it. Now, in a way, my argument is pretty simple and maybe simple-minded, that this really is the kind of thinking that goes into Marx's conception of mode of production, of the capitalist mode of production, that it is a negation or cancellation of, this is very general, of the feudal mode of production, that it is, that at the same time it cancels it, it negates it, but keeps it as a particular moment. In other words, there are leftovers, aren't there, of feudalism within the capitalist mode of production. We still have a Queen of England, or now a king, and so forth and so on. But then we raise up to a new Gestalt, and that would be the capitalist mode of production, which historically stretches from, let's say, the late 15th, early 16th century. Marx goes through this into the present moment. Within that mode of production, that larger one, there are various moves that go on that are themselves, one could consider, smaller modes of production. And I want to go into a couple of those. But at any rate, here are Hegel's words from, translated in English, of course, from page 51 of the introduction, not the preface, but the introduction, which is an incredibly dense and complex chapter in one of the great books that's ever been written. He says, but when, on the other hand, the result is conceived as it is in truth, namely as a determinate negation, a new form has thereby immediately arisen, and in the negation, the transition is made through which the progress through the complete series of forms comes about, excuse me, of itself. but the goal is as necessarily fixed for knowledge as the serial progression. It is the point where knowledge no longer needs to go beyond itself, where knowledge finds itself, where notion or begriff corresponds to object and object to notion. Hence, the progress towards the goal is also unhalting, and short of it is no satisfaction is to be found at any of the stations on the way. Well, I think that this would be the idea or the absolute that Hegel is so often simply accused of ending with the moment of meditation and so forth. I think the book is more complex and troubled maybe than that simple progression might suggest. But at any rate, in Marx, we see, again, a similarity of thought, but not to that end. For Marx, and that's something I hope I have time to end with, is what Marx probably had in mind as an ending, which would be at the same time a new beginning and unthinkable, really. Okay. And I want to come around to that. Now, another place in Hegel, and I probably for interest of time shouldn't go, I find it so endlessly fascinating. In Hegel's Science of Logic, the greater logic, in the Miller translation, in page 106 and 107, he begins a section called The Sublation of Becoming. And it's a very fruitful, in terms of our thinking here, very, very fruitful section to sublate. And the sublated, that which exists ideally as a moment, constitutes one of the important notions in philosophy. And I'd like to go on, but I think I'm not going to at this point. But this, again, the Science of Logic, remember what a tremendous impact it had on Lenin's thinking. I mean, his thinking changed from being sort of strictly empirical and straightforward to being extremely complex. After reading, I forget what year, Hegel's Greater Logic. So also, I think it also has its impact and is a way station in Hegel's dialectic, and Marx would have known, of course, did know all of this. In Capital Volume 1, let me just point quickly to, I just have some examples here where I think this is at work. If I can find them. Marx, there's a chapter on manufacture as he goes through the mode of production, capitalist mode of production and its historical development. It's followed by a chapter on machine production. And I think that in that passage, the character of manufacture, the capitalist character of manufacture, involves artisans and handwork and everything we would think of as a kind of manufacture. But with the development of machine production, labor becomes generalized and not specific, and those old skills fall by the wayside, except in very special circumstances, not in a dominant mode. And so machine production becomes the nature of the capitalist mode of production. And of course, that's a lot that goes in that. But I think that here we have a large instance of the materialist dialectic at work in Marx, where you have the development of manufacturing, and then with the development of steam engine and engines, machinery in general, you have the cancellation, preservation, and transcendence or overcoming of that in the course of capital. And so that kind of thing doesn't have to happen only once. I mean, we have plenty of examples of in terms of computerization and so forth, and all the aspects of the internet and of now of AI and so forth. Who knows, exactly how thorough these transformations are, because there's so much hype involved with these new things. But the same thing is always going on, as Marx argues. Capitalism is a process, not a thing, and it's always transforming, and it's always changing itself and meeting new needs. It also is always self-destructive and destructive of the natural world by its very nature as it goes along. And this, of course, we're familiar with. In Capital Volume 2, which is about circulation, and I'm not going to take the time to quote from that, but one of the kinds of dialectic we find here is what I would call the dialectic of work. And I forget which page, 136, I think, and 7. Yeah, 136 and 7 are the example I wanted to point to there. But I'm not going to, again, I don't want to read those because it would take too much time. But again, as we're in this, you remember all the circular graphs and notes involved in Capital Volume 2. It's pretty complicated, but at any rate, productive capital, as we find it in Volume 1 for Marx, with the end product being, well, the commodity, but also a use value. That's, for Marx, a kind of admirable stage. The circulation, then, as we get it in Volume 2, is where capitalism takes advantage of, exploits wage labor, and where value, which becomes this huge uncontrollable structure, develops through circulation and the power of money and so forth, as these are all kind of by the capitalist class historically engineered to promote accumulation. Then I think, how am I doing for time?
Just at 3:40, so probably about out. So, but if you go to take another minute or two.
I'd like to, I hope this is fairly clear. It's very general, I know, pretty abstract, but I think that this is what Marx did. He structured his work by means of this kind of well, you could almost say a canceling of Hegel's thought, a preservation of it as a moment in a zone, and uses that then in transforming it to another gestalt, the modes of production theory and all the fruits of it. This is what basically Marx does with Hegel's thought. It remains incredibly important. It's a structuring mode of thought in his mature work, at least, probably in all of it. So Hegel was concerned with the progress of consciousness. He's concerned with many things. Marx calls him that mighty thinker, and he certainly was endlessly fascinating. But he uses a speculative dialectic, and you can find it there's a really good statement on it in the preface to the the work on, what am I thinking of? Anyway, it was another one I mentioned. Economic and what is it? I have all these books here on my desk along with others. At any rate, for Marx, the progress is the history of social being, of the formation of the capitalist mode of production, beginning, and the idea, the way of thinking becomes not a speculative but a materialist dialectic for Marx, and that he uses throughout. Now I'd like to end with a look at volume 3 of Capital. And one of my favorite things in volume 3 is actually chapter 48, which is called the Trinity Formula. And there's a passage in there because if Hegel ends with a kind of stasis, a kind of meditative stasis with the mind of the philosopher at work within itself and so forth. And that's at least certainly a view of it. Marx ends this way. He says that the real wealth of, and I'm looking at pages 958 over 959, and I'm going to end with this, reading this passage, because this is where Marx is going. The real wealth of society and the possibility of a constant expansion of its reproduction process does not depend on the length of surplus labor, but rather on its productivity and on the more or less plentiful conditions of production in which it is performed. The realm of freedom, and this, I think, is Marx's actual concern, is the realm of freedom. The realm of freedom really begins only where labor determined by necessity and external expediency ends. It lies by its very nature beyond the sphere of material production proper. And then going down a couple of sentences, this realm of natural necessity expands with his development because his needs do too. But the productive forces to satisfy these expand at the same time. Freedom in this sphere can consist only in this: the socialized man, the associated producers, govern the human metabolism with nature in a rational way, bringing it under their collective control instead of being dominated by it as a blind power. Now, it's important to note here that he doesn't say human governing nature or ruling nature. He says that the human metabolism with nature must be governed in a rational way, the metabolism itself, bringing it under their collective control instead of being dominated by that metabolism, by that desire, blind desire to dominate nature, instead of being blind. Accomplishing it with the least expenditure of energy in conditions most worthy and appropriate for their human nature. But this always remains a realm of necessity. Okay? The true realm of freedom, the development of human powers as an end in itself, begins beyond it, though it can only flourish with this realm of necessity as its basis. Now, people who write about kind of utopian accounts of Marx's work, so forth, I think tend to eliminate that realm of necessity and say, well, it will just be a realm of freedom. Or Rosa Luxemburg does this, for instance. Although she's a great comrade, of course, but she did have this idea of a kind of static socialism. But for Marx, that's never true. There is always the realm of necessity, and it needs to be reduced as efficiently as possible so that the realm of freedom can then grow and human powers can be realized both socially and personally. And that, I think, is a truer sense of where Marx is headed than many a utopian account would want to admit to.
All right, so I'm going to interrupt you there, Rich. I think we're going to, so number one, thanks so much. I think we're going to have to switch it over and move on to some discussion now. Again, I want to indicate to the folks on YouTube, or if you're watching us on Facebook, please do hit us with your questions. We'd be very interested to hear those. As of right now, I don't see any. Jake, if you can alert me when there are any. But Sid, before you get on that job, Jake, you have any questions you want to lead off with?
I mean, let's see. I mean, I had two bits. I think, Rich, I think it struck me. Your end made me think of Fourier, and sort of the use of passion and attraction, in the sense that necessity isn't is required. I think that is something that like the excessive utopianism gets at with the idea of automation and all of the rest. And I think perhaps it is structuring or changing the relation to necessity that is dialectically required in this case. And so I actually have comments for both of them, so I'll just give them both at the same time. And Patrick and Gian, I found your paper very interesting because it almost seemed like, or your presentation, your book, because it almost seems like an inversion of the logical positivist approach, in a certain sense, in like a twisted sense. I know that hopefully I'm not offending, in the sense that they insist on clarification in philosophy of language. We're going to get rid of our pseudo problems. You, on the other hand, say, no, perhaps that very approach is exactly what gets us away from the complicated messiness of everything as it actually exists. So that's why I say it's almost an inversion or a strange warping, because it's that same tendency to say, look, we are being bewitched by language, but not at all in the way that you think, because language is mystifying us in this sense. Does that make sense? I hope. But just a couple of comments, perhaps to stimulate a little bit of talking.
Oh, very, very interesting. I'll jump in there. The connection to the logical positivism. So here's a quote we like. Philosophizing requires, above all, that each thought should be grasped in its full precision, and that nothing should remain vague and indeterminate. That's Hegel. Okay. So that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah.
So this is, I mean, it is I like that question because how our book relates to analytic philosophy is a question, and I think we want to come back to it. I think actually at one point we say something like we think that factoring philosophy is a better term than analytic philosophy, to see where problems are. Because I mean, who's an analytic philosopher? Is Donald Davidson? He's one of the stars in our book. Is he an analytic philosopher, Donald Davidson? How about Quine? Go back one. I mean, who's an analytic philosopher? Well, I don't think that's so easy to answer. Well, a logical, if you want to talk about logical empiricism, well then, okay, that's something else, and that's what you did raise. I mean, I think the logical empiricism fits in with what Gene said about when you have this split, the epistemic Midas touch, right? If the more I'm involved, the more I falsify what I'm trying to know. Okay, and I think logical empiricism is really based on that assumption. And so the idea is, what do you want to get it down to? I mean, this is Carnap, and what do you want to get it down to? You want to get it down to sort of unimpeachable sense data, and then connecting those with logical operators. Okay, so I think generally it's considered that project failed, but what was driving it is what we're trying to get at. What was driving it is what we consider the dogma of the epistemic Midas touch. And this is really what, Rich, you quoted from the introduction to the phenomenology. Those first 8 pages or so of the introduction to the phenomenology are really taking on the Midas touch. They're really a direct attack on the Midas touch. And they're really,
because they all presuppose the separation of mind from its object. You can do it in terms of like his lime twig. You can do it in terms of the lens. You can do it in terms of the I forget the other, the sort of the openings to analysis, but they all share. Here's the object. Here's the subject. How do we get them together? And as soon as you get them together, you're into the realm of, well, it's true for us. So let's subtract the filter, let's subtract the lens so we can get to the object unimpeded by the filters or lens of the subject. And Hegel, in just a few pages, says, well, that gets us nowhere. Let's start again. And he starts again with consciousness. And the great thing about Hegel's notion of consciousness in the preface is it's always consciousness of. It always has an object. It always has an object in the world. So you're never in the mind trying to find an object. He sort of, I would say, revolutionizes the notion of consciousness. Others will share that view, that it's not an inside. It's consciousness of, sense certainty, of the things we perceive, of of God.
Right. I think Marx really misinterprets Hegel on this, on the concept, the begriff, that he's still kind of thinking of it as some kind of mental thing that's somehow then creating the world. Well, I think when you look at Hegel, no, the concept is always in the world, just as Gene's saying. The concept is what's developing as, let's say as you go through a passage like the Phenomenology for these different gestalts of consciousness, but they're all worldly, right? So my first exposure to economics was Robert Heilbronner's little book, The Worldly Philosophers. But what we've come to conclude is that the economists are precisely the unworldly philosophers. They don't have a world. In the real world, there are social forms. Either you're a wage worker, or you're an enslaved person, you're a serf, you're some kind of a free worker and a communist. I mean, they don't. It's a kind of worldless philosophy. So a book that thinker that we admire a lot is Frank Farrell, who works off of a lot of the same sources that we do. That's the Heidegger about being in time, and Hegel, and Donald Davidson, not Marx. So that's not, he doesn't figure in. But he talks about kind of recovering the world and recovering the self. So when you split the world, mind and world, or subjective and objective, well, you're really losing the truth about both of them.
So on that note, and in order to kind of turn to Richard, I have a thought or question, and this really has to do with what I guess there are two pieces, and I'm going to build it around the phenomenology, but I think my question really, Rich, is how does it translate toward Marx and Marx's method? So the two concepts I'm thinking of are the labor of the concept, number one, or it's an idea, I guess, in Hegel, to me, a sort of central methodological theme. And relatedly, I think this idea already in the phenomenology of the highway of despair. So, and the point I think there in both cases is you can't skip to the end, right? It's not as if, and this goes to something that Gene said about the argument, just placing arguments here and there. But I think what the labor of the concept says is that there has to be mediation, and it actually has to happen. Like, it has to happen through a process. And if you don't do it that way, then in fact, you don't get to the true end. Ultimately, you have some kind of false result, right? And you get these, what they call these pseudo concepts or false abstractions. So I wonder, Rich, if you could talk about the labor of the concept in Marx, and then also how that can become material, so that there's the labor of the concept could be a material process. So I'll turn that over to you.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, it's a big question.
It's a huge question.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. It's a really huge question. Marx develops his whole mode of thought in all this work, and of course he worked political action all the time, towards changing the world, and towards that was one attitude. But he also thought that the world would, how would you put it, change on its own. In other words, the passage from Hegel that one of you quoted about the completeness of the thought and so forth, in a way, that's the way Marx thinks about modes of production too, that no mode of production ever passes away before it's reached its fullness. And so there's an almost anti-revolutionary moment in Marx with that. And that's always kind of puzzled me. I haven't figured that out. And I guess that would be what's the relation of thought to fundamental social change? And I think what Marx does is he sets limits on that change. In other words, not just any old change, but there is something that these transformations and so metamorphoses are heading towards, though we cannot know what it is actually. And it may be that we'll have a period of extreme violence that the whole world needs to go through before another mode of production can step forth. I'd like to bring up the issue of Heidegger for a moment. It's always a difficult one for me. I've read major works. I even wrote a paper once on Adorno and Heidegger. Adorno was one of the great antagonists of Heidegger. But Heidegger was a member of the Nazi Party. And he was a Nazi rector for a year and a half or 2 years. It was at Freiburg, I forget the university. But and Marcuse and Hannah Arendt were students of his. And Hannah Arendt was, of course, his lover. And they tried all the way until Heidegger died to persuade him to recant his association with Nazism. And Heidegger would never do it. And I think that reading what I've read of Heidegger is Being in Time, and then that little book of 12 essays, I think it's called, it's a very interesting, of course, he's a great arguer. But I can see, I think, why he would not repent, perhaps, of his associations with Nazism, because it really is very closely aligned with his way of thinking about the world. And so I find myself really suspicious about Heideggerian takes on thinking. In fact, I can't stand Nazis or Nazism or anything like it. And so I made myself go through the process of facing it fully, and with my mind as, what could we say, as objective and open as it could be. And I come out of it thinking, nah, the guy really was a Nazi. It's kind of like Carl Schmitt in a way. The same kind of problematic comes up, I think. I don't like those guys. So that's not a very philosophical statement,
though. So we're at 4 p.m., although we just dropped a heady piece of thought right at the very end. I think one piece I might say in response to that thought, I mean, obviously, as philosophers, so in a radical mode, I think, generally speaking, obviously everybody here would oppose Heidegger's Nazism. But then I think the question becomes then, to what extent, does that change our relationship to his philosophy? And obviously we all have to come up with an answer to that question separately. With respect to our specific philosophical questions, I do think, we've talked a lot about false abstraction. I know Marcuse accused Heidegger of false concreteness, which might be a kind of separate problem that would be worthy of some thought. That is, like, how do we produce truly concrete philosophy? And might that path have been one that was in some ways like tied to the politics? And we'll have to, of course, that's, again, we're at 4 p.m. now, so that would be an hour wouldn't solve any of those questions, but I wanted to put those out there. And then, and speaking of this, by the way, our question that we have on YouTube comes from John Abermite, who, for those who don't know, is responsible for helping to bring in, he helped to publish Heideggerian Marxism, which is some of Marcuse's early work. And so John is actually really, I think, useful at talking about these things. So I'd encourage anybody who's listening now to reach out to John. Sorry about it, John, to flood your email, but I think it would super help. But let me say, here's one of the questions he asks, and I think this is for the whole group. And then if it's okay, we can end on this and hopefully maybe just take a couple minutes, each of you. But John points toward Hegel's philosophy of right and says, isn't the Critique of Political Economy actually already nascent in Hegel, even, so that maybe there's a little bit of a materialist moment heading toward a critique of political economy already there in Hegel, and maybe even against his wishes, but by the force of dialectical thought. So I don't know, since I'll turn it over to Jean and Patrick first, and then we'll come to Rich, and then we'll have to close it out.
Just on the science of logic, I read the science of logic as derived from the phenomenology. The phenomenology is a work about experience. It's not unworldly. And the fundamental power of experience, Hegel identifies as, he's interpreting him in terms of the power of the forms. And so the forms of the science and logic do not exist. They are in the world, in knowledge, in history, in nature, but there's not a realm of forms in Hegel that has some kind of, I see no support for that. So in my view, seeing them as emerging through abstraction from experience is one way to look at it. On the Heidegger question, I think that, as we said, we're not phenomenologists, but this is what we take from Heidegger. Just, run through those existentials, that we're being in the world. We're always in a situation. We're always with others. We're always with things that are useful, that are manipulating the world. We're always projecting possibilities. We're always in the realm of discourse that has layers and layers of sort of unarticulated meaning that makes language itself possible. We're sort of have a sense of temporality that is different from clock time, that has a sense of the whole of our lives. We have questions about authenticity. Of course, you have to teach Heidegger by telling your students about the Nazis, because they need to know that, they need to know it. And then they need to look for it as well. But when I take the sort of phenomenological framework that corrects, I think, this is how I teach it, that if you're going to do any philosophy, you're going to do it as a being in the world. And where Heidegger is missing is he doesn't make the world a particular historical materialist form of society. He has this world, and he has a situation that you face, and he has moods and understanding. Great. But to bring the Marxian historical materialism is not there in Heidegger. And so that, to me, when philosophers forget that, when they sit down to do their critique of pure reason, not as a being in the world with others, but just as a sort of disembodied thinker, in that sense, I consider phenomenology, or just enough phenomenology, to be first philosophy. It's always behind us. And we don't have to look behind us, but we have to work out of it. So we don't have to have an argument for the existence of the world or the existence of other people, because that has to be presupposed in order to ask any question.
Brandon, you mentioned my book, The Mismeasure of Wealth. The first chapter in that is relevant to John's question, which is that the question of capital. So what I argue there is that I think it's an amazing treatment, civil society, in the philosophy of right. But I don't think Hegel has the concept of capital. So in the earlier remarks, I think like that Marx named that book Capital. It's the crucial category. I don't think Hegel has it, but he has so much that's brilliant and so far beyond classical political economy in its sophistication. I agree a lot with what you said.
Well, it's
Rich, thoughts?
hard to know quite what to say. I would George Forlas, who I think you all know. He's an old friend of mine, though I haven't talked to him in a long time, but he gave a paper on this a couple of years ago, maybe. But anyway, I knew him when he was a graduate student at the University of Oregon, and he did analytic philosophy for his dissertation. I forget exactly. I went to his oral exam several years ago. He's a brilliant guy, but he claimed, and this astounded me at the time, that analytic philosophy actually had the seeds of a revolutionary way of thinking. And he used is a subject I know little about, analytic philosophy, actually. I know as much as I want to, but that whatever that means. But at any rate, his analysis was that the ways that they treated language had revolutionary possibilities within them. And I think that was, in more specific ways, was the subject of his dissertation. I don't know, the work he does now may not relate to that, but it astounded me at the time. And he has a wonderful mind, a very meticulous, kind of methodical, but at the same time capable of grand work. So that's just a response, I think, to this question about that. Well, I'm a Marxist, and I've made my choices. I'm 85 years old, and I still remain very interested. I think Hegel is a great philosopher, as I think Kant is a great philosopher, and as I think Spinoza was. And if I think I take Spinoza as the end of the Middle Ages, the beginning of the modern period in many ways. He's a complete materialist. There is nothing of the transcendental in Hegel, in Spinoza's work. He had incredible influence on Marx, on Freud, on Einstein. It's a really interesting, compelling thought, but the dialectic is not there in Spinoza's work. And Mascheret wrote a book on that called, I think, Hegel or Spinoza is the title. Hegel ou Spinoza is the title of that book, which was very difficult for me to read, because he comes down, like that whole school does, on the side of the anti or non-dialectical mode, though it's a good book. But anyway, that's my own personal contradiction in a way, is between Spinoza on the one hand in that line, and then Marx on the other, and Hegel. I think I put Kant in there too, actually. Kant, Hegel, Marx, and then the future of Marx is represented by a great many writers and thinkers. So anyway, I'll end with that.
Very good. So I think we're out of time. Just because I love to hear my own voice, and I get the opportunity to be the last guy to speak. I'm going to give myself the last guy to speak moment, which is, I think one of the things I really love about Hegel is that the false, and this goes to your point about preservation as a moment, by the way, I think that the false is always the false appearance of the true. And so whether it's analytic philosophy or any other sort of false appearance, right? I think, and I think this is true with Marx as well, in talking about idealism or human culture, that there's a kernel of truth there, even if it's misrecognized. And so, in part, our job is to always recover the kernel of truth that's present in the false. And so, I think we can look at all philosophy in that vein, and also particularly, especially I think with Hegel and Marx as well. That we can find perhaps moments of falsehood, but the crucial thing to understand, if you're going to be significantly dialectical, is that even the falsehood is somehow connected to the truth, and our job is to sort of dig out the kernel. At least that's my personal view, and that's how I read my Hegel and my Marx. And all right, with that, thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. It was a very interesting conversation, and I look forward to reading work from all of you, and I'm going to be picking up 2 books from Gene and Patrick here soon. So thank you all so much for coming, and have a great weekend, everybody. Take care.
Thank you for organizing this. Thanks, Gene.